a giant of alternative investments. BlackStone, founded in 1985, now has around $570 billion of assets under management. It started in M&A, but expanded into private equity, hedge funds, and credit. And it's made co-founder Stephen Schwarzman one of the richest people in finance and the world. Raised in suburban Philadelphia, Schwarzman learned entrepreneurship at an early age. His father owned a dry goods store, and at 14, he started his first business. His younger brothers mowed lawns while he brought in the clients. Educated at Yale and Harvard Business School, he became a managing director at Lehman Brothers at the age of 31. He climbed the corporate ladder, heading the global M&A team before striking out on his own. From Bloomberg's European headquarters in the City of London, on this episode of Leaders with Lacqua, we meet Stephen Schwarzman, the co-founder and chief executive of BlackStone Group. Steve Schwarzman, thank you so much for speaking to us here on Bloomberg. What drives you?
That's a great question. It's a desire to do things well. It's a desire to create, a desire to make things happen.
Have you always felt this drive from a young age?
Yeah, I always was like this, and which makes it easy. That way you don't have to evolve particularly. I was like this as a teenager, and it was just a feeling I had.
A feeling of what? Of greatness, that you wanted to achieve something, to be remembered for something, to have legacy?
No, I don't care about that. It's just the moment, being able to, do something that's consequential. Could be a kid hitting a home run to win a baseball game. Could be starting an organization. Could be making something better. I always had that drive and instinct, and it didn't matter to me whether I was sort of alone doing it, as long as I thought it would be well received.
So why did you start BlackStone back in 1985?
Well, I started BlackStone because I had sold Lehman Brothers to American Express in 1984, and it's because Lehman was in financial trouble, which happened periodically at Lehman. It finally managed to auger in 2008. And so I didn't want to stay with the Lehman people. I didn't think the business really needed to have been sold. It could have been solved a different way, but people on the board didn't want to. And so I went off with Pete Peterson, who was formerly chairman but was squeezed out, in a management infighting. And we started what was the first financial boutique. Now there are tons of them, but back then nobody had done that. And so we did that, and we came up with a strategic plan to not only do M&A work, which I was used to, but also to start a private equity business and get ready to start other types of businesses, which we called at the time affiliates, where we'd attract somebody who was a 10 on a scale of 10 to basically develop an area where we saw amazing prospects coming for the future. It was so good, even we couldn't mess them up. And also, that new business would generate intellectual capital that would make our existing businesses stronger. And disappointing as it is, that's what we're still doing. But we're now doing it as the largest firm in the world in our alternative area, continuing to add new businesses, new concepts, attracting great people, and it gets easier and easier as you do it. It's tough at the beginning. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Yes, sure.
But the risks are bigger.
No. The risks are smaller because you've learned so much on the journey to figure out what works, and your ability to attract people is infinitely better. When you're a little bitty business, people don't trust the success of that business. They don't want to leave where they are. Now, the tables are turned in that because we've become a great brand name, and we almost never fail when we start something.
Did you realize back then that you would become so big?
No. How could you know that? We started something for the reasons less for the business strategy per se than the feeling. Life is funny like that. If you ask somebody to decorate a home for you, you basically do best working with that person to tell them what you want to feel like when you're in that space, not how to do it. And what I wanted was to make sure we had so much activity going on that it was really amusing, right, intellectually fulfilling, and could provide feeds so that I could understand the world better.
Why do you think you were such a success?
I think our timing was good. I think we went into businesses where if you had capability, you really couldn't fail. Mm-hmm. I think the world was moving our way, and we understood it. That wasn't luck. The idea that finance would consolidate, mm-hmm, and from when I joined Lehman in '72, where you had about 500 people, to when it perished in 2008 with 30,000 people, the difference between working at a place, yeah, with 500 versus 30,000, to me meant there would be an enormous opportunity to recruit people who just simply didn't want to be in an environment with 30,000. And that made it possible for us to bring on board people that we never could have hired.
Coming up, Steve Schwarzman on timing the markets to perfection.
When your stupid friends are getting rich, this is usually a sign that there's too much credit available.
Steve Schwarzman has been dubbed the undisputed king of the private equity industry, with BlackStone becoming the largest alternative asset manager in the world. It's the world's biggest corporate landlord. BlackStone's real estate portfolio includes Las Vegas' Cosmopolitan Resort Hotel, London's Arch Company, and housing in New York. But how has a company been so successful? Steve Schwarzman says it's all about the timing. How do you look at timing? Right. Again, we talked about you're very good at timing, so at picking something when there's a downturn, yeah, putting cash and actually making good profit.
Yeah, timing's a funny thing. How do you avoid bad things?
Right.
Well, it's like walking in a bad neighborhood. You keep looking over your shoulder. There's a feel that comes from all of the feeds, the circumstances in the world. So it was pretty easy to see in 2006 that the world was getting incredibly overstimulated, mm-hmm, if you will. And what we did is we just started selling enormous numbers of things, and cut back the number of things we were buying by about 3/4. We sold a lot, and there are a lot of indicators that tell you when you're near a top. And some of it, I have one where it's hard for me to say this, but when your stupid friends are getting rich, this is usually a sign that there's too much credit available. And some of them get it and do something and accidentally become successful. Sometimes you have securities that are issued, mm-hmm, the debt securities that don't pay interest. Some never will pay interest. Mm-hmm. You can keep paying them with other pieces of paper. The amount of leverage you get goes so high that you wouldn't even take it. When you see things like that, for example, with WeWorks, right? We invested in a company that was a competitor. It was worth £3 billion or something. It made, I guess, 150, 200 million pounds. And it was worth $3 billion. WeWorks, which was doing nothing but losing money, had a, quote, valuation of $47 billion. That made no sense. How could you have one company doing really well financially, the other one hemorrhaging?
But whose fault is that?
Well, it's not ours. It's the fault in that case of a narrow group of buyers putting subsequent rounds of financing into a company. You've seen this a few times now, where what happens is, from an accounting point of view, you keep making a profit on your old investments in that company, the more you pay on the new one. So there's a perverse incentive to keep paying more because it makes you look like you're successful. The problem becomes, once you get out of your own little circle of venture capitalists and you meet the real world, then the real world says, 47 billion, what are you talking about? Right? And so that's another indicia of a market that's in effect overbought. So you know that's a time where you really have either the red light or the amber light on for caution. On the bottom, that's actually harder, because when things collapse, sometimes people think they'll automatically get better. But sometimes they don't. I remember one situation in 1982 when the oil business collapsed, oil prices collapsed, and you could buy buildings in Houston at very good prices. 10 years later, they were the same price. So just being at a bottom doesn't make sense.
But how can you tell?
Well, what I've learned is you wait for things to start getting better. You wait for prices to go up. If you basically give up the first 10 or 15% of profit, but you see there's real momentum behind the economy, you're better off waiting, and then you buy.
There's a lot of criticism on PE firms, right? That you squeeze too much, that you overborrow. How do you face some of that criticism?
Well, I think that's basically wrong. It may have been right in the 1980s. We're so far from that. To make money in the private equity part of our business, which is only about 25% of it now, you have to buy a company and make it grow. If all it does is just lay there, or you cut some cost, nobody's going to pay you much more than what you paid. So there's three mechanisms. First, if you grow much faster, that's a good thing. If your profits grow along with it, that's a great thing. So you get a higher PE on exit, you have more E, and then you put some leverage on the company that you don't pay back for typically 10 years, so you have plenty of time and don't risk the business in any way. If you prosecute that model, you will get great returns. And the advantage that we have is we study all these things before we buy the company. We're trying not to have an adventure, right? There's enough adventure in life. And if we can get it done before we buy it, know what we think we can do with that business, and then do it, we'll make very large profits and rate of return without taking risk. And I know people think entrepreneurs like to take risk. If you ask an entrepreneur what he or she is doing, they don't think there's risk. Now, they may be wrong, but nobody's looking for risk. We're certainly not.
But have you ever got involved in something out of a gut feeling? Either an asset that you really liked or something that spoke to you, that was maybe riskier than in the past? Well,
we won't go where there's really risk. What happens is sometimes you meet a person who's an entrepreneur or a manager, and you can be taken by that person. We've had examples. One here in London with the manager who's developed Merlin, which is a big company in the UK. It's the second biggest amusement park company in the world after Disney. And when we bought that company for £88 million, one of my partners, Joe Barada here in London, who's young, he wanted to do this. I said, Joe, this is just so small, it makes no sense. He said, you wait and see. This is a terrific entrepreneur. He's going to buy other things. And, we made about, I guess, 5 times our money, on a lot of money by the time we finished. So what happens is there are times where you do respond to a situation. I don't know whether that's instinct or whatever, but it's backed by a full risk analysis on the two or three key drivers that could really make a mess of any investment. And that's where we try and add value. The upside of things, most people see the upside because they don't come to the table to get something approved unless there's really an upside. It's the downside where people, I think, fall short.
Coming up, Steve Schwarzman on facing the challenges in today's political climate.
We're clearly going through some very unusual times, enormous difficulties getting groups of people to agree on things, an adversarial nature in politics.
Steve Schwarzman is a lifelong Republican. He raised money for George W. Bush and worked with congressional Republicans on the request of President Obama to avoid the fiscal cliff fallout in 2012. And more recently, he's been confidant to President Trump and his team, eventually serving as chairman of the administration's Strategic and Policy Forum. He says in his memoir, What It Takes, Lessons in the Pursuit of Excellence, that if the goal is to help your country, serving is always worth doing. Do you ever feel like Washington and Wall Street are too close?
Too close? No, I don't see them as too close. I try and help out from time to time on certain types of issues. I always try to do stuff that I think is good for the country. It's not this president. There have been other ones. People need advice or they need help in some area, and so I'm like an equal opportunity employer. If I could do something that's helpful, in my view, not biased, but helpful for the greater good, I like to do stuff like that.
What do you think we're living through, either in politics or geopolitics or the economy? There seems to be huge shifts without really being able to put your finger on it yet.
Yeah, well, we're clearly going through some very unusual times and enormous difficulties getting groups of people to agree on things, an adversarial nature in politics. I was trying to go back and figure out, this almost feels like the 1850s before the Civil War, where people weren't even civil, in politics. And that happens, from time to time. Part of this, I think, is motivated by the fact that the bottom, you call it 25%, 35% of populations in liberal democracies are having a tough time financially, and that motivates sort of a desire to help them, but also unleashes anger and what's called populism. And that populism goes and it tries to attack people, and politicians use that, to get themselves elected. And that's put us in a very, very unusual position.
But is that because of capitalism? Do we have to rethink capitalism?
No, I don't think it's because of capitalism. I think it's because of education. And in the United States, for example, we used to be one of the top few in the world when I was young, back in the Middle Ages, and now we're somewhere between 25 and 30. We don't have a primary and secondary education system across the board that's doing what it needs to do. I'll give you one example that's actually quite instructive. I was in China, a few months ago, talking with a very highly placed person in the government, and he told me that they were going to introduce computer science to every student in China. Now imagine.
That's a big rollout.
Imagine if you take the United States, which I'm more familiar with than the UK, where we are today, if more than 5% of the students in our primary and secondary education system get computer science, I'd be surprised. Now, the difference in outcome of those people in a workplace is profound. And our workforce isn't where it should be. I don't think this is a problem of capitalism because you can only work with what you have. I think also that there's a need to help these people because we can't have a society that works right without everybody having a piece of the pie. And I think we're going to have an increase in the minimum wage, to $15 adjusted for different parts of the country. I think we're going to have to fix our education system, and with that, I think we're going to have to do something special to recruit teachers.
But so is that why you're focusing a lot of your philanthropic efforts on education?
Yes, well, I think education is the passport to a better future for anyone. And if I didn't get a good education, I wouldn't be on your show today. I don't know what I'd be doing, but I know I wouldn't be doing this.
So you've written a book, What It Takes, and it's half memoir and half life advice, I guess, for how to grow a business.
Right.
Why did you write it?
I wrote it because I was visiting a sovereign wealth fund in the Middle East, and they had a new head of it who was a royal family member. And if you've ever spent any time doing that, which most people in your audience haven't, they're treated, those individuals are treated with a certain respect and non-interaction on certain types of things. And so I was supposed to have the first 5-minute handshake with that individual. And we sat down and I just started talking to him like a regular person and, tried to ask him about what he was trying to achieve. And we ended up spending 2.5 hours talking about what he could do. And so it's easy for me to give advice like that because that's what I think about running a business that does those types of things. And people were shocked at the end of 2.5 hours. I walked out of this room. What was going on in there. And then I started getting other people. Instead of me selling them products like I used to when I was younger, they just wanted to know what I thought. How do I make my organization better? How do I hire people? How do I pay people? How do we figure out where in the world we should be doing things? Easy stuff if you know what you're doing. In fact, I didn't even regard it as work. After like the 25th meeting, I said, boy, this is getting boring. Maybe I should write a book and just hand it to them, and then I wouldn't have to have the meetings.
Steve Schwarzman, thank you so much.
Thanks, Francine.